Hi, I'm Andy Schmuckler. I have several topics planned, but I want to start with something that I didn't plan, which has got to do with the Supreme Court right now hearing the immunity, presidential immunity case at the Supreme Court. It shows us something that's really, really important and deeply disturbing about the state of things in our country. I mean, anybody with much sense knows that these are troubled times, but I think it's not widely enough known or recognized that the fact that the Supreme Court is hearing this case right now is a sign of one of the darkest things in the picture. There's no reason why this case should be heard. Everybody of any legal knowledge affirms that this, and I expect the Trump lawyers know this perfectly well, this whole presidential immunity thing is universally agreed to be a completely bogus, obviously false argument. Like so much of what Trump has done during these cases, it's a bid for time. You can appeal things and appeal things and appeal things, and you can have the most ridiculous arguments. But if you and lose at every turn, which he basically does, but he wins to the extent to which he gets the delays that he's seeking. Jack Smith wanted the Supreme Court to deal with this the way the Supreme Court dealt with the an emergency of sorts, of a similar sort, back in 1974 with the Nixon tapes. Don't make us go to this appeals court. This has got to be dealt with really quickly, really decisively, and so we can get on with doing this thing, in which there's an enormous public interest because we have a presidential election coming up, and the American people have a right to know what is the truth of the matter with respect to these, what they call a January 6th case, which involves, I would say, the most serious crimes in American history, an attempt to overthrow the Constitution, seize power against the will of the American people. It doesn't get any more serious than that. And if people are going to choose, and there's a clear chance, some people think a likelihood, I don't agree with that myself, but if there's a clear chance, and I can't dismiss it, that this guy who's been accused of these most serious crimes might actually get handed again the powers of the presidency that he abused so terribly, according to all these indictments. Well, the American people have a right to know before they have to vote what the truth of the matter is. It couldn't be clearer. Jack Smith is very good at what he does. He made the case. Anyway, I'll call this. We're here, what is it, 4.5 months later? And the Supreme Court's now hearing this thing that they never had to hear. There's an article right now, or yesterday, or the day before, in the op-ed piece in the New York Times by Andrew Weissman and Melissa Murray, very powerful NYU law school team, but Weissman in particular impresses me as extremely brilliant. And they have a piece they say there's no justifiable reason why this has to be argued. But not only did the Supreme Court, anyway, basically, to cut to at least the first stage of the chase, the Supreme Court has given Trump the delay he seeks, completely without justification, and made it most improbable that the huge public interest will be served. Now, this is part of a bigger picture. The real overarching battle in America today could be described as democracy versus fascism. Those are words, but they can be explicated so that you can see that there's a force which has been pushing America in a direction that is quite contrary to the basic values that we celebrate on the 4th of July. And it's a question about whether American democracy is going to survive against this force. What the Supreme Court did in this case, in the most obvious and blatant of situations, I mean, where the guilt of this man is already shown in terms of publicly available information beyond any reasonable doubt. Not that the jury has to hear the case properly. They're supposed to presume innocence. We citizens, if we're informed enough, know that the man is guilty of these very serious crimes. Some of them were committed right in front of our eyes. But a lot of our fellow citizens don't know what they would know if the trial were to go forward. And that's why everybody's talked about, including Jack Smith and Andrew Weissman, crackerjack guys in this field who really believe in the rule of law. They've said that this has got to be tried, public trial, before people have to choose who's going to be president in the next 4 years. And the Supreme Court, here's the deal, has sided quite clearly with the criminal against the rule of law. I mean, it's just blatant, right out there. And it signifies a huge amount. I mean, this particular criminal is the point of the spear of the force of fascism that's been rising in America for last live stream. I traced my experience with this thing and getting to see it I start with 1990 and the rise of Rush Limbaugh, gradually getting to see things and fighting against them in my way. That's what I talked about most of the time last time. This has been rising for a long time. And the point of the spear has got to do with, right now, with the Republican Party that got taken over by this sort of fascistic force between 1990 and then the rise of Trump, who is a figure who hijacked the party that had been created up until that point, 2015, 2016. He swooped in and he took this thing that had been created of a Republican base that was an extraordinary thing in American history. In general, I feel confident, though I couldn't prove it. If you had put up in front of people somebody like Donald Trump, I mean, even among the conservative people, who had the personal qualities of, flaunting the rules, being greedy, being selfish, being a bully, being a liar, being willing to use power for his own purposes, not concerned about the greater good. You could see who he was. And something had already been created by 2015, such that the Republican base was something extraordinary, I think, in American history, that it could look at a guy like that, which the fellows up there on Mount Rushmore would have said, unquestionably, this is precisely what you don't want to have as being president. And they saw him as an appealing leader to turn to and to give some kind of devotion to. I mean, people have followed various politicians in my lifetime, been fans of this guy or that guy. But the kind of following that Trump had in the Republican base, well, I know that there have been some demagogic figures in American history, Huey Long back in the 30s, but I don't really know that much about him. I'm not aware of anything in American history that's quite comparable to this political cult. Anyway, the Republican Party was made into something that he could take over, and then he took it over. He became the Republican nominee. He became, with the help of Putin and James Comey, he squeaked by into the presidency despite losing the popular vote. And then he acted in the Oval Office increasingly recklessly, all the way up to trying to overthrow the election and seize power against the will of the American people. He fit pretty well in with the overall spirit of the fascism that was gradually taking over the party and becoming less and less hidden. The Supreme Court sided with him, unnecessarily prolonging this thing so that he would get the advantage of not having all that truth exposed through a trial where only facts and the law get to speak, as opposed to all the lies he can come out and speak outside the courtroom. It's a lover of the Supreme Court. Historically, I go back to 1964 of having a love affair with the Supreme Court and its history and the whole concept of the rule of law and all the creativity and with a fairly frequent unfortunate things coming out like Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson, all these signs of corruption that have been in America here and there. Nonetheless, overall, the creation of a system in which the use of power is going to be governed by the law. And the law is going to ultimately be made by the representatives of the people, et cetera, et cetera. I love that stuff, and I love the work that's been done to create the system. Andrew Weissman and Neil Katyal and a bunch of other former federal prosecutors devoted their lives to and are really very good at explaining. I feel like I've been, educated in new ways about the law by people that have all this trial experience. And here we've got a hearing in front of the Supreme Court, which we know, they're not stupid. We know that some kind of a majority, we don't know anything about who, but we can guess, sided with the criminal, who is the point of the spear of the force of fascism that's threatening American democracy. The Supreme Court is supposed to be the place where you go to get our conflicts resolved according to the law and peaceably. They're supposed to sit on top of the Constitution and all the statutes and apply them appropriately and with wisdom, the best that we can arrange to have such a court. They adjudicate between the two conflicting sides, but this hearing today shows that this court, in the most obvious way, in the most vital part of the battlefield where the destiny of the country is going to be handled, which is the next presidential election, is a biggie. There are lots of battles going on. It's a big war. It's not going to be over regardless of how things go in the 2024 election. But this is huge. And they have made themselves deliberately, I think, beyond a reasonable doubt, they have made themselves the agents of one of the two conflicting sides, not applying the law. It was the Supreme Court of 1974 knew what their job was, and they decided, I think unanimously with one recusal, that Nixon had to provide the tapes, and that was the end of Nixon's presidency. This Supreme Court should have been doing exactly the same thing. And that's what Jack Smith said back in December, when it would have been possible for the rule of law to have held this man accountable for those crimes and to prevent the force of fascism from taking over the presidency. So people talk about might the Supreme Court hand down a decision like tomorrow or something like that. The guy from Slate, Mark Stern, three names anyway. Mark Joseph, Jacob. Anyway, he's a legal commentator on Slate magazine. He thinks that there's virtually no chance because anybody who wants to write a dissent can simply say, I'm not ready yet, and it won't come out till late June or early July. I don't, that's just a custom. But if the Supreme Court, are they going to change their minds? I wish that there had been much more of a hue and cry. I think it should have been trumpeted across the country that the Supreme Court had sided with the criminal. I love the idea that the truth can prevail in American democracy, and I always kind of believed it. If people had trumpeted what this Supreme Court behavior did of sending it back and then slow walking it after that, and then scheduling 2 months out the hearing that they really didn't even need to have. If people have been standing up there on the soapboxes or shouting from the mountaintops, the Supreme Court has sided with the criminal against the rule of law and has violated the public's clear right to know the truth about these indictments that would have been tried by now in Judge Chutkan's court. I don't know, would the American people have been able to grasp it? It does strike me that a lot of the questions one has about where is this leading, like for the November election, boil down to what is the condition? What are the strengths? What are the abilities of the American people right at this point in our history? And I don't know the answer to that. My optimism is because I've watched the election returns since, there's been a clear pattern since, say, the election of 2016. And including in the election of 2022, and a lot of special elections. I mean, there's a clear pattern that there's a big majority of American people who somehow, in one way or another, whether the issue is abortion or various other things you can see in these various elections of recent years, that people are turned off to various manifestations of this force of fascism. That is what I think is going to be decisive in November. But as much as I make claims about, I understand this stuff and I understand that, I got something important to say, I have been wrong in predictions before. For example, and I'm usually wrong in terms of overly optimistic about some part of the American people. In 2015-16, I actually wanted Trump to get the nomination of the Republican Party because I felt that Trump would effectively destroy what the Republican Party had become. And again, let me just say that the Republican Party was getting increasingly fascistic for 30, is that the right math? No, for a quarter of a century. Before Trump came down that escalator, it was already going on, and I was already very concerned about it. There's a Supreme Court hearing this case that's gotten taken over. You can see it as a project of many decades by a plutocratic force. Let's not. I wouldn't have known to call it fascistic, though. Plutocracy and fascism, is it money or is it just raw power? They have an affinity, which you could see in the fascisms that occurred in the mid-20th or early, Japan, Germany, Italy. So there has been a process going on to build this court. And the side of democracy, which is also, as it happens, Democratic Party of liberal America and various other components, essentially failed to protect against the emergence of a court that would do something like this. It didn't happen overnight. And the problem became visible to me in the 1980s, but not like I had envisioned this. But now we see what it is. And we should see it as part of a much bigger picture. It's a part of a picture of, well, what else the Supreme Court has done, for example, that with Citizens United, which had a lot of important dishonest arguments in it, they opened the floodgates so that the plutocracy could get more power. And of course, plutocracy getting more power is necessarily at the expense of the American people in general. We made a movement from democracy to the rule of money, rule by money. And then the way they gutted, what was it, Shelby, the case where they gutted voting rights, and pretended to believe that, the states of the Confederacy no longer need to be monitored. That's ancient history. No need for the Justice Department to review changes to voting laws to make sure that these aren't efforts to disenfranchise black people. They believe that? No. They were showing themselves to be agents of a current of American that fits into the fascistic mold, let's just say, and has fascistic qualities up and down too, of white supremacy. So no sooner did they hand down the decision in Shelby than Texas and North Carolina passed laws that never would have made it through the Justice Department because their clear intention was to disenfranchise vulnerable peoples, which had a big correlation with race, because those people tended to vote overwhelmingly Democratic. So it's a form of seizing power at the expense of democracy. So we could see this before their way of handling this completely bogus presidential immunity claim. You know, nobody has predicted that they're going to say that the president is immune. I mean, that's already a coup d'etat. You know, commit any crime, assassinate political rivals, and there's no issue of anything ever being prosecuted for crimes. I mean, there are amicus briefs been submitted here. I mean, people shouldn't have had to work on this thing. It's just so obviously false. But historians of the era, you know, they submitted an amicus brief about showing that, documenting this is a bunch of historians of that era and what the concerns were of the people who created this executive in the American Constitution. And it's just crystal clear that they had no intention whatever of entertaining for a second anything like what Trump is claiming. All right. I mean, I've gotten so bored with it. They keep on presenting this claim. I mean, it's so obviously false. I mean, we really shouldn't be spending so much time on how bogus it is, and we should spend more time looking at why is it that we're having to deal with this thing, even to the point where it's going to prevent the American people from finding out what they should find out when they're making a crucial decision, which actually has to do with basically what men have died for in our wars, which is to preserve ourselves in the American system. That's what they always said when they sent our boatloads of people over to Europe, that we're fighting basically for the American system of government, for human rights and for dignity and for the will of the people and the consent of the governed. This is what we stand for. So, that's what today means. The Supreme, I have, if you go to my YouTube video collection, you can search for with Supreme Court as search words, and there's a whole piece about our serious Supreme Court problem, and that problem basically boils down to that what we should understand about the Supreme Court right now is that in this battle between democracy and fascism, the Supreme Court is now occupied territory by one of the sides, and it's the wrong side. It's the side where the few get to dominate the many. It's a side where the rich get to take more wealth from the poor, and so on and so on. It's a side that facilitates the persecution of vulnerable peoples. It's a pattern which we've seen in other societies and in the ugliest times of their history. And it is part of a still bigger picture, which is what I'm a man on a mission to convey, which is the battle between democracy and fascism is really quite fundamental to the there are forces that have always been at work in the systems of human civilization that are vital to understand. And what we're dealing with in America in these times is a current major manifestation of an ancient struggle, which I'll get to. But let me stick with the events and developments of our time and switch to the first topic that I had planned on talking about. I'd like for Nicole Wallace et al. And others like her to acknowledge this GOP fascism didn't start with Trump. And when I say Nicole Wallace et al., I'm talking about a variety of people who were Republicans up until Trump emerged on the scene. And then were very alarmed and conscious of how contrary to their values and to the truth, this guy, well, one of the values is some kind of honesty. Now, I think that Nicole Wallace is really impressive. My estimation of her intelligence and articulateness and moral awareness has only deepened over time. I'm also a fan of another of the et al.'s, a fellow named Charlie Sykes, who, up until the dawn of the Trump era, was sort of part of that right-wing radio world, which, I didn't hear a whole lot about him before he broke with the right wing with Trump's arrival. But he was a guy in Wisconsin he was a friend of Paul Ryan's. He was on the radio talking from a conservative point of view and being an adjunct of the general Republican force of that era until Trump. And now he appears on MSNBC with some regularity. And I think he really does an excellent job. I mean, he doesn't pull punches. He sees things clearly. Um, I, I'm tempted also to bring into the et al. A hero of our times, Liz Cheney. Um, I mean, she's been inspiring. She was willing to give up power. I mean, in a party that was completely morally craven, almost completely. I mean, she wasn't the only one. Adam Kinzinger too. She was willing to give up her power and position out of integrity. And of course, she got punished for having integrity in that party by being kicked out of the party, kicked out of a Republican leadership. You know, but before that happened, she served on the January 6th committee and did a great job. And she's still out there. And she's still talking about this guy, Donald Trump, that her oath of office required that she do everything she could to see that he be impeached and convicted, and then when that failed, to be fully exposed to the American people for being the criminal and fascist that he is. She was just really very good. And so these people are all heroes to me. And maybe it's inappropriate. And it's not a huge deal, but there's been a part of me that's been there for a while, piping up from within once in a while saying, hey, Nicole, I'd like to hear you admit that this thing that we're fighting now, that you're really such a good ally for. I mean, one of the things I've noticed is the conservatives are much, on the balance, are the best fighters. Liberals have a problem with it. So anyway, I'd like you to acknowledge that you spent a fair number of years aiding and abetting this thing in its earlier stages. As I said, in my last live stream, I came on and I talked about my history with discovering and fighting against the rising force of fascism from 1990 on. And I think, to me, it's quite clear that back when Nicole Wallace was a staffer for the W presidency was damaging us in very fascistic ways. I'll just name, there was the way that torture was used. I mean, it's not like Americans have never done anything violative of the treaty obligations and federal statutes having to do with torture. But it's been lower down people who got out of line with their power. With the W administration, for the first time, the torture was coming from the top. And in violation, as I say, of treaties and of statutes, it was not okay. It was an attack on the rule of law, and particularly an attack on the idea that there are limits to the way state power can be used, that our founders put in there about cruel and unusual punishments and due process and all the protections, because they knew of the history of dungeons and torture implements. And then the W presidency is responsible for waterboarding, is one of the things that was done. That was there's all this discussion about is that okay according to the no, it wasn't okay. It was a bogus disagreement. It was again the falsehood, trying to claim territory to prevent the truth from prevailing. No, it was torture that we were doing. And it was against the law, and they knew it was against the law. And again, this is just, and Nicole Wallace is in this presidency, just to bring it back to that subject, And I bet she was really good. And I think she's a lovely person. I can see the president would want to have her on his communication staff. I think that's what she was on. But meanwhile, the 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 word has gone out to have George Tenet testify to the Senate somewhat falsely to manipulate us into an invasion of Iraq in the first place. And Colin Powell's gone out there and acting like he has more confidence that he's been told the truth than he does. At the very least, I don't know if I remember exactly what his, but he's out there at the United Nations selling stuff that turns out to be false. And the presidency knew that it was false, lying us into a war. And if you study history of fascism, you get to recognize some of this stuff. Now, does it matter that Nicole Wallace? I was going to say that presidency then puts out word to the Justice Department and the Office of Legal Counsel, I think it is, OLC, saying, I mean, I don't know what the exact assignment was, but I know what John Yoo created, that torture memo. Today we're discussing the question of presidential immunity. The torture memo is just a clever, what's it, three-card Monty trick to give presidential immunity. This group in justice will give advice. The people who are in power will take that advice. The people who they give orders to will execute that advice, which is criminal. But nobody can be prosecuted because one side just gave advice. The other one just took advice. And the third one was just following orders. It's a recipe for essentially presidential immunity. Any president, given that logic, any president can do anything he wants and not ever be prosecuted. Everybody's immune. Everybody's immune. That's the end of a constitutional democracy, really. When the most powerful person in the country is under no obligation to follow any laws, what do you got? There's a name for it. I mean, there are various names for it. Authoritarian dictatorship. I like to use the word fascism. It conjures up some stuff that I think is good to conjure up because it helps to illuminate what we're looking at and what the stakes are if you're fighting against it. So I don't know. I mean, she's doing a great job. Does it make a difference whether she realizes that when she was in her highest position in her professional life, maybe this is higher. I don't know how to compare them, but she's working right there with the president of the United States. Is she so? If she's going to be so offended by what it has become in the age of Trump, is there anything important about whether she recognizes that she served the growth of this thing? I don't know. At a spiritual level, I do think that it's important to recognize when you've made serious mistakes. I'm not sure what all you do with it. I mean, I admitted a few minutes ago that I misassessed what was going to happen with Donald Trump's being the nominee. I don't think I completed that thought, but I really felt that the good conservatives that I knew fairly well from living out here and doing talk radio with them for 10 years, I thought I knew that they wouldn't follow the minority faction that made him the nominee, 40%. And I thought that would destroy the Republican Party. But they all shipped off. Not all, almost all. They lost people like Charlie Sykes and Nicole Wallace. But I was wrong about that, and I look at that mistake frequently, and I think, oh, I was talking to my son the other day, and he said, "Oh, Dad, you're such an optimist." We were talking about this upcoming election, and I'm saying to him, I think there's a possibility this will be a blowout, because I don't think that more than a third of the people, if they understand what the real choice here is, would vote for fascism. And I believe that it is possible to get the great majority of the American people to see well enough what the choice is, that you get that possibility of a blowout. He thinks it's going to be very close. And I got to recognize that I made a mistake, and I can see other examples in my, I don't know, almost 60 years of making predictions that I misjudged. And a lot of time it's got to do with being overly optimistic about my fellow Americans and what they will understand, or what their values are, or how they're going to act. I err in that direction, and I try to keep that in mind when I get my sense of where things might be going, and I want to avoid just continuing to make the same mistake in the same direction. Now, Nicole Wallace's and Charlie Sykes, and there are others. I mean, a lot of the people that are very good on MSNBC are people who stayed with the Republican Party pretty happily until Donald Trump took it over. The Bulwark crowd, I think, do an excellent job. Those are former Republicans. They have a publication. William Crystal used to be of the Weekly Standard. He comes out and he says some good things too. And there are a bunch of those guys that are basically would have been on the other side of the divide that concerned me back from the beginnings of Rush Limbaugh all the way through the W presidency, and who stayed with it even when the Republicans adopted it with Obama president, and across the board a policy of obstruction, making it their priority to make him fail. That shouldn't have been okay. That is not a defensible position for an opposition party to take. That's not what people elect them to do, just try to make the president fail. He was hired by the people to do an important job. You got to at least respect that. That's what the whole spirit of American democracy is. And they stuck with it when the Republicans were blocking Obama just for the sake of making him look bad, regardless of what the country needed. I knew a man who misjudged something at that level of light versus dark, in a sense. My mistake is, being naive, or having some exalted, idealistic notion of my fellow countrymen. That's not a trivial mistake, but it's not the same as being happy to serve as fascism is taking over what you're serving. I knew a man who back in the 1930s, in the late 30s, bought into a notion of Joseph Stalin and his regime that didn't recognize the terrible darkness of the whole thing. The bugs, the Moscow trials, I don't know what, I never asked this man who's a generation older than me, what all he knew about what Stalin had done and what a human monster he was. And if he didn't know, how was it he didn't know it? But then when Stalin and Hitler, with their foreign ministers, signed the non-aggression pact, the scales fell from his eyes at that point, and he broke with that. And as a young person talking to this guy about that episode in his life, it was clear that he was deeply humbled by how serious a mistake he had made in supporting this monstrous regime with its secret police and a reign of terror of sorts. And it was the effect on him was deep. And I don't know how much it was all for the better. I mean, he was very. There's a lack of confidence about taking any kind of bold stand after that. Maybe we're better off having Nicole Wallace not being humbled by recognizing that she missed what was rising around her that she was serving. I don't know. There's a part of me that wants her to recognize it. And then when I think, well, why is that something on my mind? And I don't have as good an answer to that question as I would like. So I'll move on to here's how evil should be understood. What it is, how it works, and how it originates. This is one of the, this gets into the big pieces of the big picture. And I have wrestled in various of these videos with the question of, is it okay to make bold claims? I mean, I'm here because I believe that there's something important that I'm offering to fill in better what I'm calling the secular worldview. That there are inadequacies about the general way that people with a secular worldview, not the religious worldview, but how they regard reality. I think that there are serious dangers that come from some of these holes in our understanding. So when I say something like, here's how evil should be understood, I imagine, well, you know, there's a religious point of view, and then there's a way people with a secular point of view are likely to hear it. And I have some experience of that, which is that the people with a secular point of view, or at least a lot of them, and I don't have numbers or anything like this, I just have, you know, like many years of engagement online with people of a secular worldview around the question of evil. And what I believe to be true is that there's no important concept in that secular map of the human world in which anything should be called evil. That's what I believe, and I claim that I have a way that's perfectly respectable in terms of the secular worldview and how it comes to understand the truth. There is a way of seeing that there is, in fact, something. And the something I claim to be able to show is captured in this bunch of words. I don't know how to say it. A coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse, or consistently makes the human world more broken. I would like to say, if you were shown that there was such a thing as a consistently a coherent force that operates that way, given what you understand about how the word evil has been used over the centuries, would you accept that if there were such a thing, it would be reasonable to call that coherent force a force of evil? Now, if the answer to that is no, I'd be interested in hearing about there being such a coherent force, but I could never be okay with calling it that. Okay, I don't know where to go with that. But to my mind, it does look and act like what people with a religious point of view have understood through the centuries and millennia of Western religious history, have understood it. It fits well, I think. And I'm not going to go into that, but the idea of evil that the secular worldview tends to dismiss, as far as I can see, my experience has been, it runs through the Bible from the very first book of Genesis, implicitly and explicitly. It's out there for as a major dimension of the human world. You can go from the Garden of Eden and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil to talk about the evil ways of humanity that God observes when he decides he's going to kill them all but Noah's family with a flood. And then there are all the manifestations of evil, whether they're called evil or not, that are clearly presented as destructive and intolerable, and there need to be a battle against it. I mean, it just runs all through the biblical worldview. And people who have been in that religious framework have never had any difficulty recognizing what the secular worldview people don't recognize, which is the reality in the human world of something to be called evil. I mean, there's a lot of terrible things that happen in the world, and it's hard to imagine that people would live through all the terrible things that you can see on the pages of history without developing some kind of concept for, why is all this bad stuff happening? Why is the human world so ugly? Why is there so much torment? Why is this happening? Why are people behaving this way? And the religious worldview got handed down. And the difference between the two, let me just say, at least the one that is important to me, I don't know, I think that's the essential one. How do you arrive at your beliefs? And the religious one is a received truth. There's a culture, the culture over the generations composes ways of understanding, stories, images, commandments, a whole battery of things that gets handed down that represent this is how it is. It's received authoritatively. And you don't, the ethic is that you're a believer. You accept the inerrant truth, the dogma, or lesser degrees of, but something at core that you accept. And that included, for example, the idea that there's such a thing as evil in the human world. The secular worldview says we're not going to take things on authority anymore. I mean, that's one of the big things that, you could see the rise of science, in a world that had been dominated by the Catholic Church, like Galileo, the trial of Galileo, because he said things that violated what the church had appropriated as part of the worldview. I mean, actually, it was not part of the Bible that Galileo violated, but other stuff that the Catholic Church was wedded to in terms of, let's see, what was the problem with Galileo? Was it seeing that there are moons going around Jupiter? You know, the Ptolemaic image of the universe. I think essentially a dogma of the Catholic Church. Anyway, authority versus look through the telescope, Galileo said to the church authorities that came to interrogate him. And they refused. It's evidence. Evidence, and then you apply human reason to what the evidence shows. I am completely, well, almost completely. I've had some experiences that I don't understand, and they've had big impact on me. But 99.9% of the time, I'm really into that epistemology. Let's look at what's true in the world and see what we can infer to be from those facts, from that evidence, what we can infer to be true about, what are the forces at work in the world. Newton stood on the shoulders of the giant Kepler, who studied the orbits of the planets. And Newton was a genius at mathematics at a level that sort of boggles my mind, and was able to take the facts that Kepler had. Don't write this on your exam. My memory may be a little bit fuzzy here about did Kepler, and there's the guy, a Dane named Brahe, who anyway, they had lots of facts, and Newton was able to come up with his laws of gravity to explain this is the force that accounts for why these planets are in these elliptical orbits. I love that human intelligence has been able to do that. And that's what I believe in doing. So when fairly recently, I wouldn't know quite how to graph, like what, at the time of the signing of the Constitution in 1787, what proportion of the population could be described as having a secular worldview separated from the religious worldview, and how many a century later? And, I don't know what exactly that looks like. My sense is it's been fairly recent. And the emergence of into the secular worldview, that not Genesis, but Darwin, is fairly recent. And let me just say that all my major ideas have as their foundation the Darwinian truth about how the living system came to be what it came to be, up until the time that human beings took an unprecedented step, I might say. But I'm not going to get to that right now, except I'll just say that book is the foundational idea that behind my Better Human Story, and please feel free to anytime to go to betterhumanstory.org. That evolutionary perspective is fairly recent. And as I've said in a couple of recent, it came up in a way that in a very individualistic, competitive, capitalistic, imperialistic, individualistic time, where they saw the competition and the nature red in tooth and claw, but failed to recognize that what we're really dealing with at the fundamental level is the way that the evolutionary process creates order. And the consequence of that, by the way, is that if a creature steps out of that order, which we are the ones on this planet to have done so, that is a big point of discontinuity. And that discontinuity has huge ramifications, which I've devoted my life to excavating, starting with that book, but building beyond that. But part of the deal is that with evolution not having been adequately excavated in terms of its implications, having to do with understanding the human story, there have been some holes left in the secular worldview that says, yeah, evolution happens. Yeah, we all of us, we separated from the chimpanzees 5 or 7 million years ago, and yeah, the mammals were, after the dinosaurs got wiped out, the mammals were like this and that, and then they rapidly proliferated and filled all the niches. At that level, there's some general understanding in the culture that evolution accounts for a lot. And we get pandemics, and then we get a virus, COVID-19, and it evolves. It evolves through a process of selection, and then we watch that mutation, selection. It's part of our worldview, but big things get left out. And one of the things that gets left out is that you can see that there's a coherent force that gets unleashed that consistently has the effect on the human world of making things worse. I don't know if I should go into what do I mean by a coherent force. By force, I mean something that moves things. Like in physics, F equals ma. Here we've got a force that's moving world, let's just say. It has an impact. You can see it have an impact on the world. And looking at the facts, and here are several ways that I would demonstrate the existence of, and a little bit about the way of operation of a force that I think it's reasonable to call a force of evil. But you can call the same thing a force of brokenness, because people hear that word evil and they think it has certain implications, like you're calling people evil, or you're personifying it, something supernatural. I don't mean any of that. I mean, there is a systemic dynamic that emerges, which is what that book is trying to show. But I actually want to start with one of the lesser ways of that the question arises: how are we to make sense of this evidence? A couple of live streams ago, I talked about how did I put it in that one? It was about this. I talked a lot about the Civil War. Oh, that the Civil War is still with us, and by that I meant that that if you look at and I wrote this up before Trump, by the way. It was published on Huffington Post. The force that drove us to civil war is back. I published on Huffington Post, and I laid out a whole lot of parallels between what could be seen about the force that took over the South, drove the South, again, a force that moves things, how the South behaved from the late 1840s in the wake of acquiring the territories from Mexico, through the 1850s, which is terribly intense battle between over the issue of slavery, all the way up to and through the Civil War. If you look at how that looked in a kind of comprehensive way in the culture, in the politics, in the decisions that got made, in the ways of behaving. Just an image comes to my mind from, I looked a lot into the 1850s for several years. A scene, a member of the House of Representatives from South Carolina had an uncle in the U.S. Senate who he felt was insulted by Senator Sumner from Massachusetts. So this guy, I think his name was Brooks from South Carolina, from the House, went over to the well of the Senate, or if it's called a well there too, I don't know. And he took his, what is the word, rattan? A cane, and beat Senator again and again and again, inflicting such injuries on him that it took him, I think, a couple of years to recuperate, that he was bedridden. He was almost killed by being beaten to death by this cane. Because the guy, he felt, had insulted his uncle. And if you study the culture of the South, the idea of honor figures very strongly, particularly at the level of the Southern aristocracy. So here's a young man beating almost to death an old man with a cane when the guy can't even get up from his desk to protect himself. And the response of the region, and I believe this is 1856 or 1857, so it's not the beginnings of this decade leading to the Civil War, and it's not at the climax, but along the way, already, people from all over the South sent this representative canes as gifts. Canes like the ones he had used to almost beat this old man to death. Anyway, just an image that comes to my mind to conjure up some kind of a spirit. I use the phrase facial recognition. You know, that there's this technology that can scan through all the faces of the people who are walking through an airport, and it's got programmed in it some idea about a whole library of faces. And if they see a face walking through the airport that matches something in its memory, it highlights it. It pops up, and this is the same guy. And I use that to talk about same force seems to have returned and taken over the Republican Party in our time. And there are all these parallels that I draw out explicitly. And I think that, I mean, people might think, I think their facial recognition technology is compelled to say, meaningfully, it's true. This is the same guy. Somehow, this thing, this constellation of things, and a lot of this big picture thing, notion has got to do with the need to make connections. Make connections. If you see that the same thing, 1860, they refused to recognize that their obligation is to accept their defeat in an election and live under the authority of a president they don't like. 1860, 2020. In fact, with the Republican Party, it's not since Jimmy Carter that they've really recognized the legitimacy of a presidency when they lost. They lost to Clinton, and they tried to destroy him in ways that were completely over the line. That's not, your job isn't to look for something to impeach him on. Your job is to work with the guy the people chose. And then with Obama, your job isn't to make him fail. Your job is to work with the guy that the people hired to perform the leadership role of the president. And then with Biden, you got no basis for challenging his right to that he won the election. It's been demonstrated many times over. And then in 1860, well, we may have had our friends in the White House most the whole time since George Washington, the slave power, should have said, well, it looks like we're going to have to live for 4 years under a guy who says he's not going to let the slave power expand the way Dred Scott opened the window that it might become national, so that instead of being half slave and half free, we got this ambition to be all slave so we can take our property anywhere. Anyway, there's a lot of parallels that can be drawn. And I asked the question, if it is the same guy, what does this tell us about how the human world works? And I'm not going to go. You can go. I mean, the human world is just enormously multidimensional. You can go to child rearing. You can go to the means by which certain dogmas are enforced in the Southern culture. I mean, up until into the 20th century, a teacher could get fired if he taught about the history of the Civil War. What the historical profession would now say is clearly the truth about the Civil War. It was fought by the South over slavery. It wasn't about states' rights. But if you tried to teach the reality, there was a dogma that was imposed. There are all kinds of ways, and you can look at the political culture. Who gets to represent who gets to vote? You know, the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman concludes with this 100 and a couple year old woman who had been born into slavery, walking to use the white people's drinking fountain, and the white sheriff standing there. And you know, there is a long history of many things going on at a lot of levels that transmit a pattern through time so that it is possible when you get to, I mean, there's no one beginning point. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan began his candidacy for presidency, he began it in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which was interpreted at the time as a kind of a dog whistle, because Philadelphia, Mississippi is where the three famous civil rights workers, Goodwin, Cheney, two white young men from the North and one black young man from Mississippi working for civil rights, were murdered. And Reagan chose to send a signal at that time. And you could go back further to Nixon's Southern strategy. But I think that it's mostly just gestures at that point. The real coming of the thing that the facial recognition thing can recognize, I think, well, for me, I started to see it in 1990 when I heard Rush Limbaugh on the radio. And then Newt Gingrich and his ways of dealing with the people he was trying to persuade. I think that it means that there is moving through the culture in a whole variety of complex ways and in shape-shifting ways and amorphous. So that the Ku Klux Klan that comes out in the 1920s has got as much to do with anti-Catholicism as it's got to do with anti-Black, but it's all got a certain spirit in common. You can see these things that are connecting and interconnecting and managing to transmit a pattern. How the family is operating, the way the authority gets to speak, and the way that those who are subject to that authority are required to listen. All kinds of things, and I just have an intuition about how it works. I've lived in the breadbasket of the Confederacy here in Virginia for I moved here in 1992. I had 6 years off in New Mexico. And I had a lot of conversations with people. So I just take in what I've taken in, and my sense is there's a lot of ways that this is getting conveyed. And it tells me there is such a thing as a coherent force. This is a coherent force. It's able to hang together well enough to move from the 1850s into the 2000 and teens and 20s now. And it does, if you look at how it behaves, if you look at what the role of this thing was back in the middle of the 19th century, hugely destructive. Hugely. The country's biggest nightmare up to this point. And now you look at this thing that the facial recognition technology says, it's the same guy. And again, it's having a hugely destructive effect on the nation. And we'll see how far that goes. We'll see if we win in this November. We'll see if it can be pushed back into the recesses where it doesn't have access to being the thing that calls the play about what the American future will be. So that's one way of seeing a coherent force. And of the three I'm going to present, that's the least of them, because I just haven't really developed it as thoroughly as the others. Or maybe that's not true. I mean, somehow it just doesn't feel as strong as the others. The second one is the one that tipped me off, actually. It's not the best. The best one's the last, at least in my opinion, because it really ties in the whole human story with this coherent force. And that's an important tie-in. But what I really discovered was there came a point, I think it was 2004, when I saw that the Republican Party that I had been able to observe fairly, always interested in the news, since Eisenhower's years, not even some of the first term even, had become something really fundamentally different from any major political party in my lifetime, from the Republican Party of before, and I think different from any major political party in American history, unless you consider the Democratic Party of the 1850s. How much was it in control of the slave power? But anyway, very consistently, what it said and what it did made the world worse. Up until then, I could see that the Democratic Party, toward which I've always leaned, but not shied away from finding fault with, and the Republican Party, with which I have basically rooted to defeat, but had some respect for their having certain virtues and standing for certain things more effectively than liberal politics always did. That it was consistently now not acting as a mixture of constructive and destructive, but consistently having a destructive impact. So I ask myself, and I ask you, if it can be established that there exists an actor on the human stage, it could be an individual, it could be a political party, it could be a whole nation under a particular regime, all of whose impacts on the world were destructive. How would you explain that? I mean, it's not like you're flipping a coin. If it's coming up heads every time, heads being destructive in this case, something's got to explain it. There's got to be something. I say there's got to be some kind of coherent force that is waiting, as in W-E-I-G-H-T, the die or the coin or whatever. So it's not an honest toss of the coin. It's a predetermined, because there's a thing back there. There's a force that's creating a coherent effect. It's acting like an it. And if it's an it, that means it's a coherent force, and it's consistently working to make things worse. Well, in what way? Well, it's spreading brokenness at every turn. What do you say about a political party that when the whole human species is facing its biggest challenge with climate change, uses its power and its voice to prevent anything to be done to meet the challenge? Because the fossil fuel industry doesn't want to diminish its short-term profits. What would you say if that same party, when it came to relationships between the races, at every turn exacerbated the hostilities, disenfranchising the more vulnerable race, misinterpreting, listening to the cry from the heart that Black Lives Matter, because we've all seen videos in which policemen are treating Black lives as if they don't matter, misinterpreting them as being something of not a cry for respect from our fellow human beings, from Black people who have to give their children the talk because their lives are in danger if they ever confront a white policeman who pulls them over on the side of the road. Making things worse. And what about, people were saying, not even before Trump became president, we had a real problem of inequalities of wealth in America, that this has gotten to or maybe even beyond the gulf between the haves and have-nots, the very, very richest and the rest, since the Gilded Age in the late 19th century. I wonder if it's even worse, but and Americans had always said that it's important to have a powerful, dominant middle class and not be skewed like the Latin American countries so often were, between the hacienda crowd and the poor peasants. Made a democracy very hard, people said in the 1950s, when we were in the business of trying to spread democracy. And here we've got inequalities of wealth that are dangerous, beyond dangerous, worse now than in Latin America, with worse social mobility than in the countries in Europe that we used to be a lot better than in terms of social mobility. And what does this same political force do? Well, they pass a $2 trillion tax giveaway to the very richest components of the society, to whom they've already given more political power, et cetera, with Citizens United, like I said. You could go up and down all the issues, and no longer did the Republican Party represent some important value that maybe if you left it just to the liberals, they wouldn't take it sufficiently into account. No, they were continually pushing things in the direction the country ought not go. What does that mean? I think it means that there's a coherent force that in some senses has taken control of that thing. And it's not a mixture of, for all intents and purposes, it's not much of a mixture anymore. Like most things in the human world, individuals and political parties, virtues and faults, etc. No, it's pretty completely controlled. It's a pure case of what happens. It enables you to see this coherent force more clearly than it is when you've got all these mixed things interacting and being, each of them doing good things and bad things and with mixed results and stuff like that. Here you get a pure case, and you can look at the consistent way that what you might call a pattern of brokenness, whether it means reinforcing our destruction of the climate system or reinforcing hostility between different ethnic groups or religious groups or racial groups, or it means increasing the power of the few over the many. They all map onto something you can call better and worse. And I'm not going to go into, that's another part of the secular worldview, that my better human story, I think persuasively puts to rest that there is a real important and life-serving thing called the good that may not be easy to describe in detail and clarity, but it's clearly there and it's clearly important, and evolution has put us in it. I'm not going to go there right now. But all those directions, there is a better and a worse. Having a climate catastrophe is worse than getting human civilization to live in harmony with the planet. Having goodwill between the races is clearly a better human world than one where there's racial conflict, et cetera, et cetera. So you got a coherent force that's consistently spreading a pattern of brokenness in a whole variety of domains. And it's this pure case that reveals that you can get things to come together to take over something. You know, the three places where I've found the most pure cases that I feel like I'm fairly knowledgeable about. One is what's happened to conservative America since the first Bush presidency, as Limbaugh and Gingrich were rising and changing a normal party into something abnormal. The second one was that I studied in some detail with respect to my book. Should I try to show that thing? Well, nah. Anyway, I've studied the Nazi regime pretty intensively since, I think, even before I went to college, but certainly in books that I've written about the healing the wounds that drive us to war. That was a regime that pretty well qualified as a pure case of consistently damaging the things it had impact on. And the other one was the thing that took over the South that had been there for a long time, like back in the 1830s with what's his name, John C. Calhoun, the senator from South Carolina. I mean, but the way it evolved from, say, 1830 to 1860, it eventually became something of a pure case. And in each case, I think you can see a variety of forms of brokenness that exist in the human world that come together. And that, like in the case of the South, and all three, there is kind of a lust to dominate that is an identifiable force that you can see how it actually gets engendered into the culture, through the culture into each generation. There's also a force of greed you might call attention to. The slavery system was the source not only of the power of the ruling aristocracy, it was the source of their wealth, and they were able to use their wealth to augment their power. And you can just go on. You can identify various currents that go into making it this coherent force. And when I saw it take over the Republican Party, my eyes were opened by an experience that I can't explain. but set me on a trail to find out what does this mean, where I saw that the darkness that had taken over the Republican Party in September of 2004, when I was watching the Republican National Convention on TV. I saw something, and then I went to study what's the implication of this thing that got weirdly shown to me. So I was impressed that there was this pure case that showed the reality of something that has to be there if you're going to try to explain the evidence. It's just too non-random. If every time you flip the coin, it comes up destructive. There's something governing it. And what is that something? How are we to understand that something? How are we to understand how it operates? And I saw that that something had components as well, and that there were different forms of brokenness that rather readily made alliance. So the part of how it becomes a pure case is that it takes forces that you might look at separately and puts them under the same tent. So that, for example, I explain how the Republican Party came to this as being, this is a piece of historical analysis that I'm kind of happy with, that until the spirit of white supremacy split from the Democratic Party, which it had always been housed in up until LBJ in the 1965 signed civil rights legislation. That started a migration so that whole force by the 1990s, even Strom Thurmond, the Dixiecrat president, candidate for president because of race issues, had become a Republican by the 1990s. That up until that point, the force of white supremacy and the force of corporate greed, which I believe would be identified as the two strongest forces of brokenness in the American system, from, let's say, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln until until 1965. They canceled each other out because they were in a two-party system. The one with the white supremacy was fighting against the one with the corporate greed, and they didn't entirely cancel each other out. But when you brought them both under the same tent, when Strom Thurmond is there with the Chamber of Commerce, not opposed to him, I mean the spirits and forces that they represent, that creates an alliance so powerful that the normal Republican Party could not withstand it, the way it was able to keep the plutocracy an important component, but not the whole ball game. There was room for virtuous people like Dwight Eisenhower and Gerald Ford, and even the first Bush. Not altogether virtuous, but decent guys. I mean, you look at the note that George Bush the first left for Bill Clinton when Bush left town for Clinton to become president, and you compare that with what Donald Trump didn't do with Biden. And it even, I think, goes beyond the fairly decent thing that W did when Obama replaced him. W is a puzzling guy, great ex-president, such a nice guy. But there was another side of him that was served as president with Karl Rove and Dick Cheney. That's another mystery that I ponder. So we can see that something took over, we can see that alliances got formed. When I first started writing about this pure case, though I wasn't using the phrase at that point, in, let's say, giving talks about the concept of evil, which I did in various places in the country, in world ethical society platforms and Unitarian churches. I saw some other components of American brokenness were also a part of that alliance. American imperialism, that's the way we came to own this continent is not a pretty story. One of the places that, putting aside the landing of the European pilgrims and all that followed from that, and foundation at Jamestown, I think about manifest destiny and the arguments that I've studied from the time, the ways that the dominant culture entitled itself to deal with peoples whose land it was the way they did. It was God-given. And I don't fully understand why the W crowd was so bent on having a war, invading Iraq. I mean, I've got my theses. But I believe that the spirit of American imperialism, which I believe was embodied pretty powerfully in Dick Cheney, played a major role in that decision. Disastrous decision, I might add. And then at the same time, when we invaded Iraq, we also had rise to the top some really ugly forms of American religiosity. I'm thinking of Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham, who who talked about America, a Christian country, invading Iraq, a Muslim country, in language using the word crusade, if I recall correctly, in a way that hearkened to so much ugly religious arrogance that Western civilization transplanted to the New World. I think about the movie or the book by Michener, Hawaii, depicting the missionaries played by, what's his name, the Swede, oh God, names. You know the guy I mean. There's an arrogance, a kind of righteous entitlement to impose your way of being and thinking and believing on other people. That's also a kind of brokenness. It doesn't lead to the ideal human world when people are acting toward other people with that kind of arrogance. And when Billy Graham's son took that current of American brokenness and injected it into the world, when the world was already looking askance at what the United States was doing and violating the international order the way we were. Anyway, you see things coming together. And so part of the way, what it is, how it works, and I'm leaving aside for now how it originates. But that's an important one too. But how it works is it works to spread patterns of brokenness, for some kind of brokenness, and all those things are broken in themselves, and their impact on the world is to make things more broken. And that there's some kind of a natural affinity. And I feel that my theoretical work is incomplete on this point, that there's a place to take it further, that the force of white supremacy that migrated from the Democratic Party to under the tent of the Republican Party with the Nixon Southern strategy and Reagan's opening his campaign in Philadelphia and Mississippi, and all the way up to Trump and his various expressions of racism, being the son of a Ku Klux Klan guy in New York, et cetera, et cetera. That somehow there's an affinity between that kind of bigotry, lust to dominate, greed, etc., and the corporate world is readily embraced with the racist world. I think that there is some kind of a natural affinity that points to a concept of brokenness. And I don't, as I say, I don't feel like I feel fairly confident that that could be worked so that it ended up holding water, but I haven't done that work. But in any event, the alliances do form. The Republican Party of today does represent various forms of brokenness. It represents an industry like the fossil fuel industry that's willing to sacrifice the human future for its own short-term profits. It represents all those feelings of white racists that get expressed in various ways that we can see that Trump has facilitated, opened the door for, that people had felt squelched, but no longer. You know, the Ku Klux Klan, they recognize that this is their guy. We've seen that dialogue go on. That's a form of brokenness. Racism is not what you put into the recipe for building the ideal America. Overcoming racism is what you put into the recipe. And so on you can go. All the ways and you want things to be whole, all the way up to preserving American democracy, which means that power ultimately rests with the people rather than the people being victimized by the power of the few from the top. Actions. And one of my concerns about the futility of the mission that I'm on is that I think that I'm up against an intellectual culture, by which all I mean is, you know, we human beings are born with these brains, which can go in huge numbers of ways. I mean, you study different cultures around the world through history. I mean, people have been all kinds of different things. I mean, I'm speaking English because I was born in New Jersey. If I had been born in Nanking, I'd be speaking Mandarin Chinese or some form of Chinese. It's all a matter of what your experience is and what the culture teaches you. It sort of boggles the mind how many different ways we could be human. To have a mind like Shakespeare's, that kind of imagination, to want to burn women at the stake because whatever. There are all kinds of ways of being, all kinds of ways of thinking. I'm advertising for a way of thinking which looks at the connections among things and sees patterns that reveal forces that are a very important part of why the world develops the way it does. And that understanding, I maintain, could be very useful in seeing to it that what we do as we build our future from the place we're in right now is more likely to lead to in the direction of the way we want the human world to be, rather than some dystopia or complete self-destruction. And I have the regular mantra of saying I think it's a toss-up whether in the not so many generations to come we will get our act together or we will destroy ourselves, because I think I can show, because we are becoming so powerful in our weapons and our impact on the biosphere, muddling through is gradually disappearing as an option. We're not going to just keep muddling through as we have for 10,000 years. We got to bring the thing under control. That's part of what I think that I can show is the case, because I can show what the nature of the forces are at work that are going to determine whether we get our act together. On the one side, you got this force that's working to make things better and more whole. And on the other side, we got this force that's working consistently to make things more broken. And we're living in a time where that's all kind of vividly displayed before our eyes. How brokenness begets brokenness. And that leads me to the third thing, I say vividly displayed. You can look at America and a question of fascism versus democracy. That's pretty stark, I'd say. You can look at the situation in Eastern Europe, where the Russian fascist dictator has invaded the democracy supported by the democratic Europe to incorporate that into, with lies, unless he believes that Ukraine is, with its Jewish president, is run by Ukrainian Nazis, which I doubt. He's not a stupid man, I don't think. But Putin versus the Ukrainians, that's pretty stark. And then if you look at the scenarios about climate change, I don't know how far, how catastrophic this thing could be. My sense is that we're still in the very early stages and it's already having a major impact. And I think early stages means it's going to continue to gather increasing momentum over the course of, already baked into the cake. Here I may be beyond my knowledge. I'd like to know what people like Mann and Bill McKibben would say. How much catastrophe is already baked into the cake? How far into the future is it going to continue to get more? But anyway, we're facing a rather stark choice. And scientists have been raising the alarm pretty loud and clear for more than 30 years. I'm not in that field. I first wrote about it in 1976. We got a serious problem, and there's been a confrontation between the requirements of wholeness and the greed of a force of brokenness that is what gets created in our economic system over time. And that's a different force of brokenness. I've got a book about it, The Illusion of Choice, How the Market Economy Shapes Our Destiny. I believe that the evidence shows conclusively that every industry that's put in the position the fossil fuel industry has been put into chooses to kill for money. And I don't believe that's representative of what people would choose, but we got systems operating. So we got stark choices. We've got an international system in which there is no order that prevents Putin from doing what he did, which means we are in the same position we were in 1962, when there was a superpower confrontation over missiles in Cuba that I think there's widespread historical agreement could have resulted in a nuclear holocaust, but fortunately we made it through. We have every reason to believe that those kinds of confrontation, and if we got the same kind of lack of international order that we had in 1962, and we do, Putin's shown that we do, you know, there is no rule of law in the international system. And that's been a problem since the rise of civilization, which is what that book looks at the implications of. And if we might have blown ourselves up in 1962, then it follows that we're playing Russian roulette. Who knows how often we're going to have crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's say it's twice a century. I don't know. I think that we were already talking about how Putin has been rattling his nukes to intimidate the West from helping Ukraine. And we also have had conversations about what might happen if the Chinese aggressive words about and gestures about taking Taiwan by force leads to a war between the United States and China, two powers with massive nuclear arsenals. That could go pretty ugly pretty fast. We're playing Russian roulette. If we are spinning the thing and twice a century we pull the trigger. You can't play Russian roulette indefinitely and get away with it. What can happen eventually will happen. It's just mathematical logic. So it is important that we understand what we're up against. And that's the title of my 2015 book, What We're Up Against, the destructive force at work in our world and how we can defeat it. Because that destructive force, if we do blow ourselves up or bring the whole biosphere down on our heads, and then some theoretical cosmic historian looks at, well, what happened on Earth with that civilization thing? And they look at how we got from where we are right now to that unfortunate outcome. They will find that there were forces of brokenness that were operating, moving through the human system that led to that kind of nuclear holocaust between major powers, or led to that climate catastrophe that so destroyed the human civilization. I don't know how completely. I mean, it looks bound to create a lot of migration of peoples who are beset by rising sea levels, and droughts. And we've already seen just with little Syria, when climate produced a civil war, which produced migrations, which produced all kinds of disorder in the human world in Europe, and really aided the rise of fascism in European democracies. It's simply a fact that societies have difficulties with dealing with big waves of migration, and if climate change is going to create them, well, that's not going to help. It's not going to help us move the way we want to move to what we might envision as the world that we want to be moving toward, the one that can survive for the long haul, the one in which people can thrive and be fulfilled, where there isn't a lot of brokenness going on. Well, the best way of seeing how there is that force of brokenness is looking at that, the way brokenness begets brokenness. And that idea of a pattern of brokenness, having to do with making connections simply by tracing causes and effects. I mean, in my secular worldview, that's, that is sort of a gold standard. That's a bad phrase to use, just popped out of my mouth. What do I want to say about cause and effect? That's how the world works. I mean, I talked a while ago about why I don't hate people, and I tried to show the nonsensical nature of the idea of free will. The religious perspective on evil has always been, oh, well, if we have an all-powerful, all-good God, an omniscient, how do we end up with all this evil going on, all this terrible stuff? And people say, well, he also gave us free will. It doesn't make any sense. I tried to show that. I'm not going to try to show it again. But cause and effect is basically what the point is. If I had been born into precisely the body and precisely the environment that Adolf Hitler was born into, what else could I become? But what he became, where would something different come from? So we're all fruit of the world, and that's why I don't hate anybody. And I use the old Yeller image that if the dog becomes rabid, even if you love the dog, you got to deal with the fact that it's dangerous. But you don't hate it. You don't stop loving the sin, even loving the sinner, even while you got to deal with the disease. He's a carrier. Donald Trump is a carrier. He's a very, very broken guy. Everything he does in the world makes things more broken. Poor guy. Not somebody I'd want to be. Cause and effect. So here's how to see the force that is reasonable a coherent force that drives things, the human world in bad directions. You look at everything that's sort of the opposite of the ideal we would want. Injustice, war, hate, greed, the whole set of many forces that are not the way they should be. And you ask, how did that become that way? In other words, of what causes is this thing the effect? And I believe, and I confess that I don't have a systematic, matrix in which I did demonstrate the truth of this to a 0.005 degree of significance. But having sort of asked about cause and effect for a lot of years now, it seems to me to be very true that for the overwhelming number of causes for this broken effect, they're all other forms of brokenness. Wars leading to injustice, traumas leading to behaving damagingly in the world out of a need to be superior. Trump's narcissistic injuries inflicted by a father who drove his other son to suicide, I think. Then creating this broken person. The father produces a son, and then ask about the effects of this opposite of ideal thing that we can identify in the human world. What are the effects of things being set up in this unjust way, where people are treated this way, where, for example, Black parents have to tell their, especially adolescent sons, how to avoid getting killed by police. It's not a happy world. It doesn't make the world a happier place. The distribution of wealth so that the top 10th of 1% own a huge proportion, more than the bottom 50%, or whatever the numbers are at this point in America. That is not the ideal distribution of wealth. If you ask what the effects of that are, they also will be overwhelmingly other forms of brokenness. They're not the same form of brokenness. Greed produces other forms of brokenness in the world, like the people coughing out their lives because the asbestos companies kept secret that what they knew about what asbestos was doing to their workers and their communities. Brokenness begets brokenness. And so if you can see that this pattern of brokenness, that these causes produce these effects, and then when these effects become causes, they have these consequences, these effects, and they're all forms of brokenness, that there's shape-shifting ways in which the pattern of brokenness gets transmitted through the human system. And then you ask yourself, well, if a force is what moves things, and a pattern of brokenness is what's getting moved, well then, what's moving it? What is that force? And I say that the force is simply a natural dynamic that emerges in the world of a civilization creating species, and that's what I claim that I can demonstrate. That once you've got that creature stepping out of order, which selects for what can get its DNA into the future, which means selecting not just individual species, but whole communities, you end up with an anarchic system. And I say that I can prove that any creature anywhere on any planet in the cosmos that steps out of the order in which it evolved biologically by inventing through its own creative intelligence, culturally, a whole new way of life, is stepping out of order and into disorder. And inevitably, that disorder will have the properties of anarchy, a war of all against all. And that, in turn, generates a destructive force. A destructive force that can be called a process of selection for the ways of power. That what can survive and spread of all the human options that are conceivable that might come out, if there's a war of all against all going on, over time, only those cultural options, only those ways of organizing a human civilized society that can survive and spread in that kind of environment, the ones that can prevail, are very non-random. And it's non-random, and it's not chosen by the people, it's chosen by the dynamic of the system. Where there's anarchy, warlords, gangsters inevitably rise to the top. That's what happened in Lebanon when there was anarchy in the late 70s and early 80s, happened in Somalia. You could just see warlords, gangsters. They get a disproportionate say in deciding how the civilization will survive, will develop. A destructive force is unleashed when people, because they're creatively intelligent, put themselves in a world in which there's going to be a lot of trauma. Not because they wanted it. Who knew that if you started gardening and herding animals, the trail led inexorably to people getting ground up in chronic warfare and enslaved, and empires being set up that were ruled by a tyrannical few. But I think that I show that that's inevitable. So here's where you get the concept of evil to be incorporated into I think, a more complete secular worldview. The concept of evil, meaning a coherent force that consistently works to make things worse, can be seen transmitting this pattern of brokenness, you can see that there's something that's an it in a way, a coherent force, in the way that you can see the wind, which you can't see, but you can see, oh, we got a wind because the trees are swaying and the clothes are flapping on the line. We think we can see the wind. If we look at the whole dense network of cause and effect, the connections that get made show a force in the same kind of a way of the swaying of the trees, the spreading of a pattern of brokenness from one form to another, shape-shifting through time, through the generations, through the centuries, even through the millennia, all the way up into our time, where in our particular situation, we've got particular kinds of patterns of brokenness that are operating. We got patterns that we can see in the American past that have fed into what we're dealing with now. We can see patterns in Russian political culture, which has been such a terrible thing, from Ivan the Terrible to Stalin to Putin. Boy, poor Russian people. It moves through time. And then it gets tied into this other bigger thing, that all this can be derived from understanding the implications of a creature that's been evolving like all the other species on the planet in a niche, acting up until, say, 10,000 years ago, very much like a primate band. The size and structure and the means of subsistence, pretty continuous with the niche which they evolved biologically. But what's different about this species is that it's got a creative intelligence. It's not lusting to unleash a force that will give the spirit of the gangster a disproportionate say. It's not doing that. It's just, for whatever reasons in that circumstances, innovating, creating a different way of life, where the plants that the women used to gather are now being planted and controlled as crops in a garden, and gradually and the animals that the men used to hunt, well, some of them are apparently you can lock them up in herds, and you have access to them as you wish, and you might even get dairy out of them, and like that. I don't think anybody ever milked wild ancestors of today's milk cows, but you can with cows, and people evolve with that, and the cultures that are milking animals are actually developing new mutations that allow them to digest lactose. But the other things that are going on is that it becomes possible to organize in a whole lot of different ways. It becomes possible to control more land. You can have decentralized governance, loosely connected, or you can have a centralized thing. Well, which one's going to do better if there's a war of all against all? I got a whole chapter on that in that book from the University of California Press, still in print from the SUNY Press. And we talked before. I mean, I talked. I'd love to talk to you, but with you, but about how huge of a variety of ways of being a human being there are, or there can be. Looking at different cultures, looking even at different families, and we're just we do have an inborn nature that really matters. But given that, with varieties of different life experiences and varieties of different cultural and family structures and culture, this and that, we can become such a big variety of things. But if there's a war of all against all, not all of them are going to be conducive to survival in that kind of anarchic situation that favors the warlords. And the ones that are good at surviving in that kind of an inevitable situation, that's not a function of the creature, but is an inevitable systemic dynamic because they've left order and gone into that kind of disorder. They're not going to be the ones that are best aligned with meeting human needs. They're not going to be reflective of human nature even. Any creature that is cultural, which any creature that ever gets into civilization is going to have to first be cultural, is going to have a lot of plasticity, and which means there are all kinds of ways. The selective process will be given a vast range of choices about human consciousness, about social organization, ultimately also about technologies and belief systems and epistemologies, so that we get, in our times, we can see that a society that comes to its truths by scientific means is going to do better in warfare than the more archaic societies that didn't. I think of the scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where there's a confrontation at about 50 feet between Harrison Ford, Indiana Jones, and this guy in Arab gown who's doing all this fancy stuff with the sword to menace, and then Harrison Ford just shoots the guy. That sort of emblemizes how industrial civilization out of Europe dealt with more archaic. The choice to become this way or that way is often compelled. The ways of power become a necessity, not because people want that, but because they can't avoid the necessity for it in a system that's anarchic. If Ukraine survives Putin's invasion, it'll be because they are backed by rich, powerful, sophisticated societies. The Europeans have some weapons. We got more weapons. They got money. We can get it to them so that, but the Ukrainians by themselves wouldn't do so well. When the Japanese saw the European empires carving up Asia, they said, and this is a line from a book that I use that line in that book. I think it's Butterfield talking about, well, I forget what the book itself was about. He said, the Japanese said, we must either industrialize or get swallowed up by the rest, like the rest. And so they industrialized and they made themselves into a modern power. But they didn't choose that because, we really want to be an industrial society. They didn't want to get gobbled up like the rest. So some became colonies because the more powerful societies were able to work their will in a system that allows the ways of power to spread, even if that's not what serves people best. And the Japanese, they became like the Europeans. They equipped themselves to be able to take on a European power, and Russia, somewhat of a modern power in 1905. And they beat them. And then they took on the sleeping giant in 1941, and they were not big enough and strong enough for that. But that's how it has worked in terms of the force of evil. The coherent force emerges. It mandates certain things, that human consciousness takes some forms, not a single form, but there will be plenty of things to choose among to enable certain kinds of things to play a big role. I've said lately, for example, that if you take the 4 people who currently are having the biggest impact on the world, I think all of them are sociopaths, except for one. I think all of them are basically tyrants, except for one. I'm thinking of the people having the biggest impact on the world right now. I guess there might be five if I were to include Xi from China, which I didn't before, who's made himself president for life. I'm not sure what to do with him, but Putin for sure, a human monster. Trump, I mean, have we ever seen a person who more flagrantly manifests more human defects? I haven't. And Netanyahu in Israel, his behavior has been, he's been so willing to sacrifice the good of his society to serve himself. And there's a history that goes before that. I think calling him a sociopath is not at all a stretch. And I mean, all the people who worked with him that have split and said they'll never work with him again because he betrays people. And then there's Joe Biden, who has basic fundamental human decency, is doing his best to do good, and has often done a rather good job. But I think he made some real mistakes in handling this Gaza situation. But he's not a sociopath. He's not a human monster. But these people that are human monsters, they're not a representative sample of what we as a species are. I mean, think of the people you know. How many of them are like that? I don't know. I've known a lot of people. I can't think of hardly anybody who would measure up to any of those sociopaths. But if you're operating in a system where brokenness begets brokenness, where there's a war of all against all, where there's an inevitable selection for the ways of power, where the spirit of the gangster inevitably gets a disproportionate say in how things are going to move in the human world. So you end up with a moment like this where we're really legitimately concerned about where we might be heading in some potentially very dangerous directions because of all those guys, including Xi, who's not willing to accept that maybe Taiwan is entitled to go its own way. It's been on its own since Chiang Kai-shek went there in 1949. That's a long time. Do you have to go at them like you have to establish your empire when people have done a pretty good job of building a society that's working rather well? Yeah. That kind of Chinese aggressiveness and nationalism, it may be understandable given the experience that the Chinese had when they got carved up like the rest, when the European imperialists treated them the way they did. I mean, you can empathize with everybody, but it's not okay. There's a force of brokenness at work, a coherent force that moves through the human world, through the processes of cause and effect, which are hugely complicated, but are not completely undiscernible when you sort of look into how did it become like this? How did we get to have a person like Donald Trump in the position he's in now? How did Russia come to be sending Russian troops to do what they've been doing in Ukraine? How did we get to have a Hamas that would commit the atrocities they did to set a trap for the Israelis to kill their people? And how did we get an Israeli regime that would jump right into that trap? Ask those questions enough, and you come up with an idea of this is how evil should be understood. This is what it is, a coherent force that consistently spreads a pattern of brokenness that makes the human world worse. This is how it works. Broken people do broken things. Broken societies are unable to control the force of brokenness that history has implanted in them. And how it originates? Here's where the idea of the evolution of civilization comes in. It is not a picture of human nature. The religious people did recognize evil, but they misconceived it, in my view. They personified it in something supernatural. And they also personified it in saying, well, we are evil creatures, original sin, human depravity. And it blamed the victim as far as I'm concerned, as I see the history of any civilization creating species. Anybody on any planet that does that is going to show the same ugly face. So when God looked down and saw all that evil around Noah and his family, rather than repent, having created such an evil species, I think the better understanding is, yeah, something got unleashed. It inevitably would get unleashed when you take the step after 3.5 billion years where evolution is continually choosing things that can work like a perpetual motion machine and keep getting into the future, even as asteroids come and go and ice ages come and go. There's this building of order. But if after all that, life enters a completely new zone with the civilization creating species that is creating a new life form, not handed down genetically, but invented out of the creative intelligence of the creature. And creating a situation with a multiplicity of these things that are not going to be in any kind of regulating order that makes sure that things are okay. Then we get a war of all against all inevitably, and then we get a selection for power inevitably. That any creature that does that is going to have that kind of coherent force embedded in the system of cause and effect. That drives things in the direction of brokenness and might destroy that species' civilization if they can't get it under control in time. Because eventually they're going to be able to destroy themselves, because that's the way cultures grow. They get more powerful. Eventually they're going to cross the line into they could destroy themselves. And if you are going to combine that with the destructive force that gives us the spirit of the gangster, still having a big sway on how things unfold in the human world, or in that civilization creating species world, it may end in self-destruction. That's the challenge that we face. That's what's visible to me about where we are in our saga. We go back, as some kind of ancestry back 3.5 billion years, and multi-cell organisms for 500 million years, and it took until 1 billion years ago to make any cell that's like all the cells in our bodies. But that eventually happened. We got ancestors that go all the way back. But if you look at the ancestry that we've got that emerged as primates, as mammals, and then as primates, you can see that we were part of a system, and the system was being shaped so that the way that the various components of the system interacted would work. That's what gets into the future. The wolf and the predator and the prey are part of the pattern of survival for both the predator and the prey, unless you got an invasive species or something like that, like in Australia. That's what evolves. And then the step onto the path of civilization creates a whole new game. It's really vital to understand that the step onto the path of civilization is a significant, supremely big deal. It generates a force, inevitably, not out of the nature of the creature. I say the ugliness that we see in human history and in the world around us now is not human nature writ large, and I claim that I can prove it. I really do think I can. If you'd want to know whether I do, besides, please subscribe to this series where I'm a bit more chaotic about how I do things. It's refreshing because I've been very systematic in my writings, and I suggest you go to abetterhumanstory.org if you'd want to know if it were true. I feel a lot of confidence about sending you there. I don't feel a lot of confidence about how many people want to know. But it is true that if life anywhere reaches that point of discontinuity and unleashes a new kind of systemic force, there's going to be an inevitable conflict at the center of that creature's history, unfolding story. A conflict between the destructive force, the coherent force I've been talking about all this while, and then there's a force that's been built into us by evolution. Evolution having put into us a variety of things, which I really enjoy talking about these days. It's kind of a new thing, but our experiential tendencies that are part of our inborn nature. There's a lot to be said about how if there's a force of evil that arises inevitably with civilization, there's a force that can be used as to inform our struggle for the good that evolution has put into us because it was life-serving in our ancestral past, which is a big clue about life-serving, says a lot about good. So good versus evil is an inevitable battle at the center of any of the drama of any species that steps onto the path of civilization. I believe that is an inevitable conclusion from looking at our story and at the inevitable dynamics in it, because we were the creatures that stepped onto the path of civilization, not because we were evil, but because, unlike any species before us on this planet, we had some kind of capacity that allowed us to change the whole nature of the system, which inevitably plunged us into anarchy, and we haven't yet dealt with that successfully. And I don't think we will deal with it. I mean, no, let me put it this way. We're more likely to deal with it successfully if we understand really what the nature of the forces that are contending. And democracy versus fascism as an American drama at this point in our history, that is one of the big theaters in history. And at a very crucial moment where we've got nuclear weapons and we're upsetting the Earth's climate, it is a very big drama, and it is a manifestation of that larger drama that would be inevitable at the heart of any creature's civilization. Understand the nature of the challenge, become more likely to be able to meet the challenge. Thank you. I'll be back on, what's today? Thursday. I'll be back on Monday. I didn't get to a couple of today's topics. I'll choose some topics. Please subscribe here. If you're willing to take this on as well, I feel that there are two ways I'm going to lose people. I'm not going to lose people by people going to check it out. I'm not worried about that one. I will lose people two ways. One is they'll think, oh, this guy, he's making these claims. Can't be true. I mean, I never heard of this son of a bitch. Okay, that's one way of losing it. And I've been worried about that because I hate the idea of people thinking of me that way, which is why I wouldn't make these kinds of claims out loud until fairly recently, when I feel like my time is limited. And the other way is, I'm not sure how many people would care to have a big picture that clarified all those things, clarified what kind of creatures we are, clarify why our history has been the way it's been, clarify what the nature of the challenges that we have to face, clarify to a rather limited degree, but in a general way, how we might go about meeting that challenge better. I don't want to oversell that. I'm not sure how many people are even looking for that kind of thing. I've talked before about how when I was growing up, there were some big ideas out there. They're not out there as strong as they used to be. Freud and Marx, as I mentioned. But more remarkable to me is that there's nobody else out there that I'm aware of that's got a major perspective that gives a big picture, that explains a lot of stuff, illuminates a few things, from which I infer that maybe people just don't think that way in this point in time, in the third decade of the 21st century. I don't know. So what I want to ask of you is, if you know somebody who's really serious about understanding things, who thinks that ideas can play an important role and they're not just head trips. A lot of ideas are just head trips, but I don't think that these are, which is why I'm here. If you know somebody who actually likes to bring in to their mind something that might give them a clearer picture of some things they want to understand better, I hope you'll share something of this series, my writings on a better human story with them, with your recommendation that they might check it out. I'm not super optimistic I'm going to succeed in my mission, but it is fulfilling to me just to do my best. And I appeal to you, if you would like to know if my claims are valid, check it out. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.